Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Plagues, Epidemics, Peculiar Beliefs and Practices Through Time, Delving into Primary Sources, which is sponsored by ProQuest. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you should be able to follow along with the presentation materials. Along the right-hand side, you may see a Q&A panel and a chat panel. If you don't, you can use the little arrows to expand and contract those panels so that you can use them. Please use the Q&A panel for any questions that you may have for our speakers. If we have some time at the end, we'll answer a few questions, and we will answer as many as we've got time for. So please do send in your questions. And if you're having any technical issues, that's what you can use the chat for. That should message me directly. And we will talk about that offline and troubleshoot the issue privately. Also note that we are recording today's program and that everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version. All right, that's enough out of me. Let's move on with the presentation. And I think first up, we have Farana. So,
thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Plagues, Epidemics, Peculiar Beliefs and Practices Through Time talks, which will last approximately 1 hour. Now, before we get started, just in case you're curious, the image to the left is called a flu tank. It's a sort of self-contained vehicle to help infected people go back to work. It was published in a British tabloid called The Bystander just a few years after the Spanish flu. In today's talk, you will hear contributions from 3 anthropologists based in London, Massachusetts, and Paris. In part 1, 2 ProQuest product managers with an anthropology background will be working with PQ primary sources for this talk. PQ, by the way, is ProQuest. The 2 speakers are myself, Farana Hock. I'm a senior product manager of Early Modern Books and the Visual History Archive, and currently a PhD candidate in social and medical anthropology at University College London. This photo of me is taken during my fieldwork on the borders between Bangladesh and Myanmar, surrounded by cultural experts from astrologers to traditional medicine practitioners. To the right is Samantha Lubrano. She is an associate product manager at ProQuest, working on history and social science primary source databases. As you can see, she also has a background in anthropology, but this time with an MS in human paleobiology from George Washington University, as you can see from the image. In part 2 of the talk, it is a great honor to introduce Professor Laetitia Atlani-Duault. Laetitia is a French social anthropologist with an impressive track record. She is a research professor at CEPET, the University of Paris, the scientific director of the Fondation Maison de Sciences de l'Homme, and recipient of Medal for Research Excellence awarded by the France's National Center for Scientific Research. She is also a visiting professor in North America and Europe. In March 2020, she was appointed member of the COVID-19 Scientific Council, French government's scientific response to the pandemic. She is also the director of the new WHO Collaborating Center for Research on Health and Humanitarian Policies and Practices. In her talk, Laetitia will share a critical analysis of the politics and practices of humanitarian aid and health, including epidemics, on both the local and international levels. She will also share her experiences as a member of the French Scientific Council for COVID-19. So before we get started with the specific content of our presentation today, let's take just a few moments to remind ourselves about the importance of primary sources in research, teaching, and learning. There are some key stats I'd like to point out. According to a research study conducted by ProQuest in 2018, over 98% of faculty believe it is extremely important to assign primary sources to students to develop their critical thinking skills. And 95% of faculty assign primary sources in their teaching to develop students' research, analysis, and information literacy skills. Examining the survey a little further, you can see that alongside developing critical thinking skills, primary sources also enable a greater understanding of a topic, as well as allowing students to come to their own conclusions. In working on this presentation, neither Sam or myself are experts on pandemics, but when researching the topic using primary sources, we were able to gain a broader understanding of a few pandemics in history. We used original documents to attempt to answer our own research questions on this topic, and we are excited to share a selection of the results with you today. So let's dive into the history of pandemics. So this table briefly summarizes three major pandemics that Sam and I will be looking at. First of all, the plague. As you can see, the plague was known under different names, and that significantly, only by 1885, approximately 1300 years after the first outbreak of the plague, was the plague bacilli discovered by the French biologist Alexandre Yersin and named Yersinia pestis. We now know that the bacilli travels from person to person through the air, as well as through the bite of infected fleas and rats. In contrast, the Spanish flu lasted approximately 1 year, but resulted in a devastating death toll. The outbreak was at a time when world media, in the form of newspapers and first photographic pictures, captured the progression of the disease. HIV, 40 years on from this, is still with us today, and my colleague Sam will navigate us through how contemporary society has represented HIV through magazines, films, and monographs. I will be looking into the plague, also known as the pestilence, the great mortality, and the Black Death, by examining historical primary sources in the form of handwritten papers and historical ordinances and government reports. The resources employed were early modern books, which covers early English books online and early European books, as well as the Cecil papers and UK Parliamentary papers. The image to the right, portrays a broadsheet from Ebola, published in 1665, showing the 7 plagues in London. I believe that this could be a biblical reference to the 7 last plagues of the Book of Revelation. First of all, some handwritten letters, voices from the time, and we anthropologists love this. The Cecil family, this is where the Cecil papers are based on, were a significant force in British history, and the Cecil papers have become a crucial tool for research and teaching in Tudor and Stuart history. The collection includes correspondence on matters of state and policy facing early modern English governments. So the first letter to the left in 1564 is from Germany and mentions the consequence of the plague breaking out. The nation could not mass gather to confirm the new emperor into power. A letter to the right, dated 1598, explains how the plague broke out in London, with 161 deaths. In this extract, merchants petitioned Robert Cecil with a complaint about the quarantine regulations imposed on traders. The quarantine regulations stated that ships coming up the Thames to London should remain empty for 40 days downriver from Woolwich, and that the goods that had been on board should be stored in open fields. However, the merchants argued that it was impossible to unload the ships without cranes and facilities to protect them from the elements, and most of the goods they carried, which were soap, ashes, pitch, tar, and corn, were not liable to be infected anyway. Moreover, they argued that the voyage to London was nearly 8 weeks, thus constituting a virtual quarantine by sea. This slide shows two works in early English books online from 1592 to 1665 that reveal early beliefs around the plague. The plague was seen as divine retribution, which linked the plague with ideas of sin and apocalypse, acts of God, and alignment of the planets. By this logic, the only way to overcome the plague was to win God's forgiveness. We can see this in the work of 1665 from early English books online. This work is still anchored in a religious worldview that the best medicine against the plague would be to drink a good draught of humility, or David's tears, and throw away all infected garments to put on Jesus Christ's garment as defense against the plague. At this time, some wealthier men joined processions of flagellants that travelled from town to town and engaged in public displays of penance and punishment. There is also evidence that people tried to make sense of the devastation caused by the plague to scapegoat outsiders. For example, in England, there were violent attacks on Flemish merchants and weavers. People attacked outsiders for no reason other than that they were different. Physicians at the time still relied on crude and unsophisticated techniques such as bloodletting and boil lancing, practices that were dangerous as well as unsanitary, but slowly tweaked the idea of purging by bleeding to purging by vomiting, and how to induce vomiting as the best remedy against the plague. These two works seem to offer remedies to help protect people from the plague, but note, at this point, we are still a long way from knowing about the bacilli discovery of 1885. Instead, the works represent a reinforcement of an existing belief system, with some evidence of adjustments as can be seen in the method of purging, the bleeding to vomiting. So in this section, I will be studying 3 ordinances in early modern books, which covers early English books online and early European books. Now, ordinances are legal rulings or orders that would, alongside printing, always be proclaimed orally. This would be done by official heralds or messengers. And after the public proclamation, the printed order would be nailed to a door at busy spots or important intersections. In Ebo and Ebe, many ordinances were repeatedly issued, and this indicates that many laws were not adhered to, and that agreement of the population was very important to an effective implementation of that law. Here is an ordinance covering 16 orders from 1603 at the time of Elizabeth and James on how to deal with the plague. It is clear from the order that both the rich and poor were seen to be equally vulnerable, and that the measures were there to help control the spread of the disease. Quarantine, for example, there was a 6-week quarantine with a mark on the door. Clothes and bedding were to be burnt. Key workers were identified in this ordinance, so parishes were to take the lead with identifying the cause of death, collecting data to share with local Privy Council, and they received financial support for these extra activities. The appointment of people to deliver food, to look over the poor, and this bit of the text comes from the transcribed materials on Ebo, as also to wear some mark on their upper garment or to bear a white rod in their hand. This reminds me of Gandalf, by the way. And to the end others may avoid their company. There is also a reference to physicians. Taxes and fines were imposed on infected towns or wealthy people in those towns to finance the infrastructure around containing the plague. And the last item in this order is very interesting because it tackles the spreading of misinformation. Again, using the transcribed text on Ebo, we learn that anyone from the religious order shall not hold and publish any opinions, as in some places report is made, that it is not charitable to forbid the same, pretending that no person shall die but at their time prefixed. And by spreading the story, such persons will be not only reprehended, but by the order of the bishop, but also forbidden to preach. And if you are a layperson spreading this belief as dangerous opinions, you will be imprisoned. To the left, there's an image with data. We have an example of weekly data collection as represented by parish records in Ebo from 1635. It records christenings and burials which were non-plague and plague-related, and noting the number of parishes that were clear of the plague at the time. This second ordinance is from 60 years later and at the height of the Great Plague of London. Many of the same points are covered as in the previous order, but there are more guidelines and measures in place. The main area of difference is the increased number of frontline key workers. So, in this ordinance, we have examiners to be appointed in every parish, 2 watchmen, 1 for the day and 1 for the night, to make sure no person goes in and out of infected houses. Women searchers or searchers of the dead were appointed and hired by parishes in London to examine corpses and determine the cause of death. And in infected houses, there were more restrictions. So the head of the household had to give notice of sickness. No one was allowed to leave the house unless they had a certificate from the examiner of health. And then there were more guidelines on the removal of dead bodies. So again, text from TCP, the burial before sunrise or after sunset, all belongings to stay in the house. Hackney coaches needed to be aired after carrying dead bodies. And there are some new punishable offences too. So no animals are allowed in the city, and dog killers were appointed accordingly. There are orders concerning loose and idle persons and around gatherings at feasting and pubs and theatres, which was interesting, but because this was at the time of Charles II. He was known as the Merry Monarch or the Party King. So there are many myths around the plague, but there's one that really relates to this ordinance and this time, and it comes from the Great Plague of London from 65 to 66, which was finally, the myth is that it was believed that it was finally wiped out. The plague was wiped out by the Great Fire of London, but the subsequent rebuilding of timber and thatch houses with brick and tile disturbed the rats' normal habitat and led to a reduction in their numbers and may have become a contributing factor to the end of the epidemic. So roughly at the same time as this order, there was an ordinance in this very small town, West Friesland in the Netherlands, that states that very similarly to the English ordinances, that it's crucial that these measures apply to the wealthy and the poor. The guidelines in this Dutch ordinance has more detailed instructions. I'm just going to pull out some of these points today. So if we look at the quarantine regulations, measures, those affected by the plague are to be brought to special plague houses, erected in most cities, and they're to stay there at their own cost until they die or get better. There are guidelines for businesses. Shops or houses where someone has been cured or died are to stay closed for a fortnight afterwards. These houses are to be marked with the letter P, which is peste, which is a Dutch word for plague. And shops that deal in clothes and textiles are to stay closed for 4 weeks. Nobody who treats ill people are allowed to frequent public places, churches and shops. So this is the guideline for the key workers. And there's more details on burial practices. So in this state, caskets of deceased people are to be dressed in black and to be sealed with tar to seal the air within, I'm guessing. And all dogs and cats are to be removed from the infected houses or killed as well. Interestingly, there's an extra one that I haven't seen before. Large bonfires are to be kept burning outside plague houses, graveyards and some busy street corners, presumably to burn the infected air. So to conclude on this little research on ordinances, it is clear that the beliefs around the plague have evolved to a commonly held understanding that the plague was both in the air, on clothes, and also on animals, and that limiting social contact was important in containing the disease. But then 155 years later from these ordinances, and in the UK Parliamentary papers, we will see how these beliefs, now called opinions, have evolved further. So in the UK Parliamentary papers, we have minutes from the Select Committee appointed to consider the validity of the doctrine of contagion of the plague in 1819. So this report shows the state of medical understanding at the time, that experts themselves disagreed on whether or not it was contagious. So for example, in 1815, Charles Maclean was investigating the plague at a hospital in Constantinople, where he soon contracted the plague himself. While he recovered, this experience gave him the belief that the plague was not contagious. He believed that it originated from the air, and he was susceptible to it because he was a foreigner and was weakened by the lack of proper food and so forth. Now, the committee very critically questioned him on his doubts of contagion, and interestingly, in response to a question on the clothing of the infected, he stated that since it is customary for the relations of those who die of the plague in Turkey to wear the clothes of the deceased or to sell them in the public bazaar or marketplace, he believed the plague not to be contagious. Others, such as Dr. Thomas Foster, believed that under certain circumstances, the plague was contagious. Foster believed that if the air in the room of an infected person was not fresh, transmission of the disease was likely. But if the air was freshened, the person intending the infected would themselves be free of the disease. So as you can see, by the 1800s, how the plague was spread was still not fully known, and medical experts at the highest levels of government were still basing their positions on their own experiences of the disease, whilst offering conflicting advice. Was it airborne, through contact, or in clothes? In actual fact, the plague seemed to be all of those. Now I'm going to be moving to the Spanish flu. So in this section, I will look at the evolution of an understanding of the Spanish flu in 1 year through historical newspapers and the British and American periodicals. This image comes from a magazine called Answers, printed in October 19, that responded to a demand for information about the flu. In 1918, much of the world was at war. With global mass movement of soldiers and displaced persons, it was at this time that the infamously coined Spanish flu spread like wildfire in the spring. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch published 3 photos of medical personnel from the Red Cross and Boston Hospital with influenza masks. The middle photo is of the Red Cross removing an influenza patient from their home into an ambulance. In May of 19, the UK's Manchester Guardian reported the impact of influenza on world leaders. The headline used the word plague to describe the influenza. The newspaper reported how widespread the mysterious plague was by listing afflicted world leaders like the Prime Minister and King of Spain. The report points to the church service attended by King Alfonso as the point of contact with the mysterious plague, inferring the dangers of large gatherings. The Spanish flu continues to spread throughout Asia. In November, the Shanghai Times continued monitoring Singapore as fatalities increased. Readers learnt of some precautions to take against a highly infectious flu, which was usually conveyed by the persons affected through coughing and spitting. The report directed locals to avoid a confined space, such as an overcrowded room, a theatre, a cinema show, and any place of public entertainment. These directions echo modern times as the report encouraged contemporary social distancing. Further, it was recommended those with the flu to self-isolate and clean floors daily with some disinfecting solution. Doesn't that sound familiar? So in December, the Shanghai Times published an article differentiating symptoms of the Spanish influenza and the common cold, as written by Dr. William S. Sadler. Publishings of this type was produced in various newspapers across the world as many anxiously confused the two sicknesses. In response to complaints about the lack of clear and consistent advice, there are some guidelines on how to prevent the Spanish flu in various newspapers from the fall of 2018. The guidelines cover avoiding contact, social distancing, wearing masks, and washing the nose and the throat. Fresh air, sneezing into a handkerchief, burning anything contaminated was also an advice. But interestingly, the food product Bovril, the thick and salty meat extract paste, similar to yeast extract, would provide bodybuilding powers to protect against this illness. Also, There's some interesting articles in the San Francisco Chronicle in November 2018 on those who refused to wear masks. They were called mask slackers. Slackers was a term at that time that applied mainly to deserters and draft dodgers and conscientious objectors. So similarly, mask slackers were arrested and fined for not wearing masks. Okay, so I've come to the end of my part of the presentation. So just to summarize, what I have learned as an anthropologist from looking at primary sources around both the plague and the Spanish flu is that controlling the spread of the disease was important. Quarantine, isolation, and social distance were believed vital to containing the disease. The uninfected would typically remain in their homes and only leave when it was necessary, while those who could afford to would leave the most densely populated areas and live in greater isolation. There were some improvements in personal hygiene, and these were thought to have begun to take place during both pandemics. The burning of clothing, bedding, and even air, sealing coffins, killing dogs and cats, shows a mixture of beliefs that these diseases were airborne or being carried in clothes and animals. Even as early as the plague, it is clear that data was valued to see how disease spreads, and local governments refine their policies accordingly, because without data, a country is blind. Interesting that for Spanish flu, masks were promoted to safeguard people against an airborne disease. Key workers were an important part of outreach. The clergy clearly formed a front line in Europe and did the data collection at the same time. Everyone who was dying had to be given the last rites, which meant the death toll among priests was very huge. There was a dedicated army of key workers interacting with plague sufferers, such as the searchers of the dead and examiners, and new roles were created to keep people isolated, such as the watchman during the plague. The medical profession initially worked from existing practice, but had to evolve their approach to developing preventative measures around the disease. I found it particularly interesting to discover the finds around misinformation at the time of the plague and the mask slackers of the Spanish flu. And the treatments were peculiar, such as the vomiting for plague and the bottle for Spanish flu, influenza. But for me, the most important findings from this review was the role of communications, i.e. the media dissemination and coverage around the diseases. Ordinances were a slow way of reaching populations with information and were localized, whilst newspapers at the time of the Spanish flu reprinted the same concerns almost simultaneously across the globe at a relatively rapid speed. So, at this point of the talk, we start to see a blueprint taking shape on how to prepare populations for an epidemic. We also see the beginnings of an epidemiological approach, that is to say, how to control diseases with a focus on places and people, animals, etc., that were most likely to spread the disease. So in this brief research, I did not cover how societies identify groups at risk. So to explore this further, I will be handing over to Sam to discuss a pandemic that is with us today, HIV. Thank you all.
Thanks, Farhana. Let's see. All right. So I am going to be discussing the HIV/AIDS pandemic using the databases LGBT Thought and Culture, LGBT Studies and Video, and Newsweek. When AIDS first clinically appeared in the US in 1981, there was little known about the origins of the disease or how it spread. As positive cases began to rise, so did mass hysteria, fueled by lack of knowledge and misinformation that was circulated to the general public. Many believed that you could catch AIDS through air, sweat, saliva, or even just touching an individual affected with the disease. A Newsweek article printed in 1983 reflects societal response to AIDS at the time. In San Francisco, police officers were afraid to come in contact with AIDS during first aid work, so they were issued resuscitation devices and rubber gloves. Medical professionals and lab technicians refused cases with infected patients. Abroad, fear of the disease led to xenophobia against Africans. In India, a few African students tested positive prompting the government to round these students up, forcing them to leave the country. In Belgium, all foreign students were forced to do mandatory testing, most of them African students from Zaire. However, according to medical professionals, this didn't prevent the spread of the disease, because Belgians were still traveling to affected areas and were not required mandatory testing upon their return. This mandatory testing of only foreign students was considered to be racist, especially against the African students who were the main targets. The question to ask is, how societies in the US and abroad responded to the AIDS pandemic to dispel misinformation as well as understand how it's transmitted in order to prevent the spread. In the US, the Center for Disease Control set up a task force specifically on understanding the scope of AIDS in America, as well as releasing reports to the public providing information on how the disease is spread, which, as we know, is spread through sexual intercourse, blood transfusion or contamination, and breastfeeding. The CDC also discussed what they are doing to track this epidemic in the US by requiring states to track AIDS-positive cases as well as mortality rates. They also recommended possible prevention methods such as use of condoms, screening of blood, and alternatives to breastfeeding. Local governments also took up initiatives to understand the spread and transmission of HIV/AIDS to help target communities that had a high prevalence of the disease. Chicago, for instance, had a monthly AIDS statistics report that helped in understanding the demographics of those affected by the disease. They took data on sex, age, ethnicity, and how it was transmitted. Looking at the chart of the transmission routes of HIV, the most common way it was transmitted is through sexual intercourse, especially within the LGBTQ community. The second was among intravenous drug users. As we know, because of the high prevalence of the disease in both of these two groups, it helped fuel early myths that you could only get the disease if you were either a gay man or a drug user. This is obviously not the case, as many were tested positive among heterosexual couples and also children who got the disease from their mothers. So understanding demographic and transmission paths of HIV/AIDS to help stem the spread of the disease was not a method that was employed globally. AIDS denialism by the government in many African countries led to millions contracting the disease and hundreds of thousands of deaths. The documentary, Taking Heart, examines how the failure of the South African government in acknowledging this disease, combined with the high price of antiretroviral drugs, ensured that poor people could not get the treatment that they needed. Taking Heart shows how outrage ignited a movement that united people across race and class towards one common goal of the right to universal access for treatment. Even though there became more understanding of what HIV/AIDS is and how it is spread, there were still many concerns about what was being done to prevent transmission of the disease. A report from 1996 titled "A Profile of Community Area Opportunities for HIV/AIDS Prevention in Chicago," prepared for the city's health department and HIV prevention planning group, offers a comprehensive guide to AIDS prevention agencies in the region, the services they provide, and analysis needed at the neighborhood level. The report argued for the need for funding for HIV/AIDS care, treatment, research, prevention, and housing programs. Further prevention methods including promoting the use of condoms through advertisement in the media and distributing free condoms within high-risk communities, testing availability, having it local and free so it's more accessible, AIDS education through various workshops held in local communities and among youth through the public school system, and having needle exchange programs to limit the spread among intravenous drug users. One common theme among these methods is community participation in the prevention of disease. The film Sex Positive raises a host of difficult public issues that must be answered by society as a whole, like what should be done to help people protect themselves from the virus, what measures should be taken to keep those already infected from spreading the virus to others, and what kind of a commitment should society make to care for those with the disease. This film gives a voice to the many moral, legal, ethical, and economic concerns that the epidemic raises, including how the epidemic forces people with deeply held beliefs on personal freedom to confront the conflict between their principles and their fear of AIDS. One very important prevention method, and also to help dispel misinformation, is spreading awareness of what AIDS is and how it's transmitted. This was done by dispersing and circulating flyers, brochures, pamphlets, all within local communities and to those who are high risk and within ethnic groups. Some examples include the December 1991 issue of Positively Aware, the journal of the Test Positive Aware Network. The cover shows a photo of basketball player Magic Johnson, who the month before had become one of the first major heterosexual celebrities to announce his HIV positive status. The Asian Human Services of Chicago discusses Kabar, a project to raise awareness of HIV/AIDS in the Asian, Indian, and Pakistani communities. And finally, a newsletter circulated amongst Asian communities to promote information, understanding, and news about AIDS relief efforts. As with previous diseases, there is a hunt to find a vaccine and a cure. Since the 80s, there have been new AIDS drug trials that began popping up all over major cities in the US. There have also been open forums for the public to discuss what vaccines are and what can they do in the context of HIV/AIDS. As we know, there are no preventative vaccines for HIV/AIDS. However, some vaccines have been used in treatment plans for the disease. Treatment plans and drugs can be very expensive, with treatments consisting of what is known as the highly active antiretroviral therapy, which slows the progression of the disease. To help alleviate the cost of the treatment, bills have been proposed to extend healthcare coverage for those affected by HIV/AIDS but can't afford treatment, like this bill proposed by the Illinois House of Representatives. In trying to understand societal response to disease, such as efforts made by the government, society, and the individual, looking at it from an anthropological perspective adds sociocultural depth to biomedical and epidemiological understanding of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. I will be doing this using the databases Anthropology Online, Ethnographic Video Online, and Anthropological Fieldwork Online. So one way that anthropologists look at pandemics is to understand how societal structures such as racism, sexism, and inequality cause direct and indirect harm to individuals. In these two monographs, AIDS in Africa and the Caribbean, and Sex, Drugs, and HIV/AIDS in Brazil, case studies show that poverty, unemployment, lack of education, sex work, and drugs are key factors for the spread of the virus. One example case study comes from the Dominican Republic that has various sugar plantations where the cane workers, many of whom are migrant workers, live together in camps. There are very few job opportunities for women in these camps, which leaves sex work as the only reliable income, with some females starting sex work as early as 12 years old. These females have also been known to work in local towns and tourist centers during the off-season, and it's through these interactions that HIV transmission has been likely to occur. There are many behavioral attitudes and beliefs from this community relating to sexual behavior. Mainly, using a condom is ridiculous, humorous, and an unnatural thing to do. Also, one of the common religious practices in this community is voodoo, and due to this belief, disease is not thought to be produced by an external infection, but it is part of the fate of an individual arising from within because it has always been present or because of the maleficent magic of a jealous or envious person. Religion and belief systems of various culture groups can reflect how they respond to epidemics and diseases, and understanding this can help prevent transmission and spread of disease. William Raymond Firth was an anthropologist in the 20th century who did fieldwork in the Solomon Islands. In his typewritten notes on History of Epidemic Disease Encyclopedia, Firth recounts several deadly epidemics from 1875 to 1951, often following the visits of Westerners to the island. Not having previously been exposed to germs, and also lack of understanding of how diseases spread and how to treat certain illnesses, this led to many deaths. In many cultures across Africa, Asia, Pacific Islands, and Latin America, traditional healers play a major role in social and political structures, especially in isolated communities that are cut off from the rest of the world. They use their knowledge to heal physical, emotional, and spiritual illnesses. In the documentary, The Shaman and His Apprentice, it looks at an indigenous tribe from the Peruvian Amazon. In this society, there are no hospitals or doctors. The shaman cures the sick using supernatural powers. After a flu epidemic in the 1980s, the film follows a man learning to be a shaman in his tribe as the elder teaches him about herbal medicine and healing through song and dance. So how do we reconcile traditional healing with Western medicine to prevent the spread of disease? In a chapter about anthropologists meeting the challenges of the 21st century, cultural anthropologist Ted Green, who did fieldwork in Southern Africa throughout the 80s and 90s, was in Mozambique in the late 80s when HIV/AIDS was really running rampant throughout the country. Mozambique only had one physician for every 50,000 people, as opposed to one traditional healer for every 200. Recognizing the need to work with the indigenous healers, Green began working on the Mozambique Traditional Healers Project. So most healers had heard about AIDS, but lacked an understanding in how it spread and had never treated HIV/AIDS patients before. They did know about STDs, and their understanding was that STDs were transmitted by coma, an invisible, teeny causal agent that carries the disease, rather than from witchcraft or evil spirits. This allowed Green to compare the spread of AIDS to coma and also educate about using condoms to prevent transmission of the disease. 10 months later, traditional healers were distributing condoms within their communities, and the transmission rates had overall decreased. So some key takeaways that I learned from understanding the HIV/AIDS pandemic is that misinformation and misunderstanding can lead to mass hysteria, fear, and racism, which leads to the importance in understanding how a disease is spread and how to protect yourself as well as others from contracting the disease. Finding the cure continues to be a prominent theme when studying the evolution and history of pandemics. Also, social, cultural, and economic factors can foster the spread of disease, especially in communities that are in economic distress with gender and social inequalities. And finally, modern and traditional belief systems are not incompatible, but complementary, and merging these two systems can help prevent the spread of disease in communities that are most at risk. So that concludes my portion of the presentation. Farana and I have presented on the history of pandemics using primary source databases. The next presentation will be given by Laetitia, who is a social anthropologist focusing on humanitarian aid and health within the context of epidemics. She will be discussing her own experiences in this area, as well as her current work with the French government on handling the COVID-19 response in France. So
Thank you very much, Samantha, and a hi to everybody. So indeed, I am Laetitia Atlani-Duault, professor of social anthropology in Paris at the University of Paris in RD, and I will be presenting today about anthropology of humanitarian aid and health, looking specifically at pandemics. The two first presentations, as you have heard, were done by social anthropologists. The first using historical primary sources, the second one using more recent primary sources dealing with HIV/AIDS and pandemic that have been with us since the 80s. I'm going to present and to share with you a number of case studies that I've been conducting or that I'm still conducting, looking at health and epidemics, but also looking at humanitarian responses to these pandemics. Could someone move the slides for me, please? Mark, are you around? Yes. All right, so what I will be looking at is more specifically what the work I'm doing is to try to provide a critical analysis of the policies and politics of humanitarian aid and health, including epidemics, but not only, on both the local and international level. And I will share with you, as I said, 4 or 5 recent experiences dealing with epidemics. Maybe the next slide, please. But first, as I mentioned, if we are looking at epidemics through the scope of humanitarian assistance and humanitarian aid, when we speak about humanitarian aid, what are we talking about? It's a very diverse field. It's about responding to needs in situations of conflict, including health crises, but also, for example, natural disasters. But it's also about supporting displaced populations in acute and proactive crises. It's about risk reduction and preparedness, early recovery, livelihood support, conflict resolution and peace building, and many other issues. What we will be looking at here in this presentation is clearly an anthropology of humanitarian aid, looking at health and specifically epidemics issues. But first, what is an anthropology of humanitarian aid? Since it began, social anthropology has been interested in the dynamics of externally imposed change, including during colonial times. It now includes a critical look at the dynamics of social changes brought by humanitarian assistance, as well as the ways individuals and groups respond to them. Farhana and Samantha have been presenting social anthropology and looking at health, and very much a discipline of social anthropology that we call medical anthropology. What I will be talking about today is more medical anthropology and humanitarian assistance. When they look at epidemics, what can they bring? But this specific anthropology of humanitarian aid and health that we are talking about here is trying to bridge the eternal gap between critical versus applied anthropology. I like very much to use what long-two anthropologists have been calling knowledge versus understanding versus knowledge for action. And what we try to do is to simultaneously both dialogue with aid professionals and trying to understand the organization of society through the dynamics of social change brought by both the crisis, health, political crisis, and humanitarian assistance. So it's about working and using social anthropology both as a practical tool, sometimes even advising government, I will speak about that later on, but also as a tool for critical political reflection as an academic that I am also. So now I will share a few experiences with you. The first experience of being a social anthropologist looking at humanitarian assistance and health, and especially epidemics. Again, I've been working on many different issues, not only epidemics, but I will share with you only today some case studies that have to do with epidemics. So the first of it is a very long field work and some publication attached to it that I did about the making of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in post-Soviet countries. I spent 10 years within one UN agency, the UNDP, United Nations Development Program, but also I did a lot of field work, traditional, classical, anthropological field work in Central Asia and the Caucasus. So both had headquarters in New York, but also in the field, looking at the making of a new epidemic in a region of the world that has been protected until the mid-90s from this epidemic. And so the focus area was HIV prevention and care efforts. And I was looking at a supposedly depoliticized epidemic, but asking myself what was really at stake. And I worked with a wide cast net, working relationship, organizational ideology, local resistance, drug users, sex workers, bureaucrats, etc., in a number of countries of this region. All post-Soviet countries recently independent. I started this work in the early 90s and ended up in the mid-2000s. Next slide, please. And so the first of all, what was at the center of that research was trying to understand the social determinants of the epidemics. As I mentioned before, the dislocation of the USSR, the HIV epidemic was almost absent in this region of the world. So what were the determinants? What happened in the 90s that explained the explosion of HIV? And that led to a number of studies, but also publication. And so that's the first result of that case study. The reasons were numerous. Just to list a few: profound socioeconomic transformation in this region of the world, corruption and breakdown of Soviet-era control, but also malaise, unemployment, hopelessness, linking to drug use, drug trafficking, increase in prostitution, outbreak of STIs, especially syphilis, very low rates of condom use, and sexually transmitted disease increasingly accounting for new HIV diagnoses. So after that first study, maybe if we can go to the next slide, what we looked at was the response to that epidemics, both governmental response, but also humanitarian assistance response by the UN and large international NGOs. And what was clear is that before 91, there was a Soviet policy in place fighting the epidemic with, in fact, if we summarize, a Soviet government that didn't consider it a problem, HIV/AIDS as a problem by the government, and because there was low numbers. But despite the almost inexistence of the HIV epidemic, in 1986, the Soviet government established AIDS control centers all over the USSR. There was still almost no case, so a kind of Soviet exceptionalism, but also a clear failure to anticipate impact of social changes brought by the dismantling of the Soviet Union. What happened after 91 is that all the governments of the region took control, of course. And what they did was very coherent with the Soviet policy that happened before, but you had a post-Soviet policy that in fact tried to control deviant, I'm quoting, behavior through state organs as before, was doing mass testing and contact tracing with coercion as before, was also isolating HIV infected people. Remember, there was no treatment at the time, with an exclusive role of state health authorities and reinforcement of risk group approach. The next slide. Then what happened is that the HIV cases exploded, and international organizations, humanitarian large organizations such as the UN, arrived in that region and tried to assist governments and NGOs to deal with this newly exploding epidemic. But the approach was totally different. What was promoted was a multi-sectoral strategy involving non-state actors. The rights of HIV-positive persons and vulnerable groups were also promoted, with, for example, a very strong focus on the decriminalization of homosexuality that was still illegal before 91. It also a large promotion of harm reduction, including anti-stigma campaigns and right to privacy. Also, and that was completely different with what we saw before, promotion of voluntary testing, anonymous, and with counseling and consent, and of course, non-coercive attitudes towards the epidemic. And what happened very quickly after a few years was a clash, of course, a clash between two visions, two ideologies, two types of response to an epidemic. And as the epidemic was accelerating, the two sides were battling. And with what we could see was people with HIV/AIDS being trapped between these two conflicting visions. One favoring a tight control of individual actions, favoring re-establishing rigid control over intimate behavior of the Soviet era, versus, among humanitarian organizations, including the UN, but not only, HIV/AIDS prevention through rehabilitating drug users, decriminalizing homosexuality, programs to convince and support rather than punish those at risk. For example, favoring local NGO over the state, or also, and that was very interesting to look at, also through an humanitarian assistance that, while fighting HIV/AIDS, while trying to respond to a pandemic, was also trying to export democracy to the former enemy of the Cold War by favoring a local NGO over the state and by participating to the dismantling of state public health authorities and a structure of social protection and health protection that was inherited from the Soviet time. So there was clearly a politicization of HIV/AIDS on both sides, and we clashed in the mid-2000s. If the first vision lost ground in the mid-90s, it is now, since the late 2000s, triumphantly, sorry again for my French accent, some words are difficult to say, being rebuilt on the ashes of the colored revolutions that have shaken the former USSR country. And there is now, in many countries of that region, a strong revival of neo-Soviet policies to fight the HIV/AIDS pandemic. So a last region to witness a large HIV epidemic, Central Asia and Caucasus. Now I do have an explosion of new cases with this humanitarian assistance provided to respond to the pandemic being, in a way, instrumentalized and manipulated by both sides. So that led to a book, which is there, but I'm not going to speak more about these first cases. I'm moving on and trying to show you another way, another example on how to use social anthropologies, looking at humanitarian assistance and health. Very different. A long also study that I did, looking at 100 years of French humanitarian aid in Africa, and looking specifically at epidemics. It was published in The Lancet not long ago. And what I looked at was how French humanitarian assistance from the colonial times to today has been, in fact, very much focused on epidemics, with a double discourse that I've been trying to criticize very much in this article. If you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So what we showed in that paper in The Lancet was a tension, and we used a lot of historical primary sources, by the way, for this study, but also a lot of fieldwork. What we showed was a tension between two traditions, a tension marked by history, particularly colonial history, that characterized the international strategy of France in the field of health, even today. What we did show is that the French contribution to global public health over the last 2 centuries has been marked by a fundamental tension between two approaches. First, state-provided universal free healthcare, and what we propose in this Lancet article to call state humanitarian verticalism. Both approaches have historical roots in French colonialism and have led to success and failures that continue until the present day. In this article, we looked at how this tension has evolved, and we especially look at 3 historical periods. During the French colonial period, so more or less from 1890 to the 50s, the indigenous medical assistance structure was supposed to bring metropolitan France a model of universal and free health public services to the colonies. But in reality, what happened is that from the very beginning, even during colonial time, this supposed exportation of the French universal healthcare, free access to the health system, was never really put in place in the colonies. What happened was a state humanitarian verticalism focusing on epidemics, from sleeping disease to HIV/AIDS or Ebola. And this double discourse, this tension, has been characteristic of French humanitarian assistance and health in Africa. That's what we try to show in this paper. So using both social anthropology of humanitarian assistance, anthropology of health and epidemics, but also historical primary sources, we try to produce a genealogy and a history of French humanitarian health aid in health in Africa, and providing a very critical analysis of the situation even today. Maybe we could go to the next slide. Thanks. So revisiting France's historic tension between universal free healthcare and state humanitarian verticalism could help strengthen its long-standing advocacy in favor of universal health coverage, and thus maybe contribute directly to advancing global equity. What we try to say is that this double discourse that my country does have on global health is not helping to promote universal free healthcare. And if we are courageous enough to face our own history, that might help promote effectively what we do promote officially, which is access to universal free healthcare in the global south. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. Third example, I've been very much working on social media and epidemics lately also, and looking especially at rumors of what I try to call, or what I propose to call, rumors of blame about H1N1, then Ebola, and now COVID-19 epidemics on social media. So we have been, with my team, doing a number of publications about that. The idea is that until H1N1, the general population affected by an epidemic was mainly looking at traditional media for information, not very much looking, in fact, to health authority for information that was supposedly valid, but looking at traditional media, the printed press, TV, radio. Since H1N1, things have changed. They are now more and more looking at online media and social media to have access to information during a pandemic. And what happened is that rumors, we have seen in the first presentation that rumors during pandemics, it has a long history. But what happened now is that rumors of blame, but not only, are spreading on social media during pandemics, and that we do need to know what's going on, what is being said, in order to respond in an effective manner to an epidemic. So not only media and communication specialists should look at what's being said on social media during a pandemic, but it's also a field for social anthropologists, including medical anthropologists and anthropologists looking at humanitarian assistance, as I will show in the next few slides. So, for example, I've been publishing a lot on that. I've just selected a few examples here. For example, in this paper, what we looked at was like the French media online, so major French print and TV media websites during the H1N1 epidemic, and we especially look at the comments posted by readers. And this study illustrates the relationship between the traditional media and social media in responding to an emerging disease. More interestingly, a disturbing geography of blame was observed, suggesting the metamorphosis of the folk devil phenomenon to the internet. We discovered a subterranean discourse about the putative origin and objective, supposedly, of the H1N1 virus, which was absent from the discussion in mainstream television channels and large circulation print media. These online rumors attributed hidden motives to governments, pharmaceutical companies, and figures of otherness that were scapegoated in the social history of previous European epidemics, notably Freemasons and Jews. And what we do find very much look like what Farhana was mentioning in her first presentation. In fact, almost cut and paste from the Middle Age and the history of epidemics in Europe, but all that now online. So there is a clear continuity in some discourse and attribution of blame during pandemics, and it's quite fascinating to see that evolving in social media. Fascinating and depressing sometimes. Maybe next slide, please. So with that, what we did with my team is a number of studies dealing with social rumors of blame, H1N1, but also Ebola on social media. I'm not presenting them all, but what I present here is something that is a good, not only a summary, but a presentation of the main results of our work, which is in fact now very much, including during COVID-19, focusing on tracking online erasation and blame in epidemics on social media. COVID-19 outbreak is stoking worldwide anxieties, we all know that. Rumors, online misinformation. But it's also an opportunity to put into practice lessons learned in studying social media during epidemics, particularly dynamics of online heroization and blame. Epidemics such as the H1N1, Ebola, or severe acute respiratory syndrome take place in a complex world with many disasters and a host of social, cultural, economic, political, and religious concerns. And responding to such concerns is not usually part of public health approach to epidemic communication, which usually emphasize biomedical and epidemiological information, but this approach is short-sighted. Our research on the Ebola and H1N1 influenza epidemics suggests that gathering online data on local perception might help public health authorities mount more robust humanitarian and public health response and better targeted health communication. And especially what we are trying to do and what we are trying to promote, including in very recent publication in The Lancet, it is investigating aeroization and figure of blame. Why? Because finding someone to blame is part of making sense of any disaster, like moral panic. Today, COVID-19 conspiracy theories, but also misinformation, are already circulating in traditional and social media. It started almost immediately. And so it's important to track evolving dynamics of blame in real time, both to correct or try to correct inaccurate information, but also to respond to scapegoating. Aeroization is important also. It's an investment of hope and trust in a context of unease. For example, during the Ebola epidemic on Twitter and Facebook in French and English, we showed that the aero status was placed on ordinary individuals, not altruistic foreigners, as in previous crisis. And when you look at what is the local aero during the pandemic, of course, it has to be very carefully done. We need careful qualitative work to understand it, because it can include whistleblowers who put their careers on the line, but also health workers who generate essential information while doing their work. All these figures are emerging during the COVID-19 outbreak. So qualitative analysis can identify issues in authorities' handling of crisis, which crystallize around transparency. Discussion can identify real uncertainties and blind spots in health commons. Authorities focus on avoiding panic and are filtering information to the public. And trust is crucial to public health system. It is during crisis that trust, especially trust in government, is being tested. And so I will finish with that. For this case study, tracking aeroization and blame in real time can help health authorities to first understand public attitude to threats posed by epidemics, but also hope offered by health response and fine-tune targeted health communication strategies. It can also help identify and amplify local and international errors, and it can identify and counter attempts to blame, scapegoat, and spread misinformation, and improve crisis management practice for the future. So this approach can surface online what we try to call in a number of publications, a complex geographies of hope and blame, which health authorities need to understand while planning response to epidemics. So that, as you could see, that's a third way of doing a social anthropology of humanitarian assistance of health, very different in the tools, and especially in the methodological tools that we use. And that was to give you a number of examples on how social anthropologists dealing with health, epidemics, but also humanitarian assistance could work. Fourth, maybe example, let's go to the next slide. A very recent experience that I do have that was mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. I've been appointed very recently in March as a member of the French Scientific COVID-19 Council by the French government. Can we go to the next slide? Which is a difficult exercise because it's about expertise, and especially scientific expertise in times of a global pandemic. And what is being asked from us scientists is to advise the French government on how to respond and manage the COVID-19 pandemic, while, as we all know, scientific knowledge about COVID-19 is constantly evolving and very uncertain. So it's a very difficult exercise, and I will try to speak a little bit about it at the end of the presentation. But first, a short calendar. As we know, the first case of COVID-19 infection in China, in Wuhan, was reported in December. Early January, WHO, the World Health Organization, is alerted of this new strain, and in late January, there is first 3 cases of COVID-19 on the French national territory. And then there is an acceleration of time. January 30, WHO declares public health emergency of international concern. Very quickly, 23 countries, including France, report 1 or more. And then there is a first death outside the Chinese territory, more precisely in the Philippines, early February. Mid-February, first death in France. We declare stage 1 of emergencies and stage 2 late February. And on March 6th, so very quick, there is a first meeting of a group of scientists with President Macron, the French president, at the Élysée Palace. So there is a picture here. I am on the left, but no, you don't see me. You see my hand, and you see women are not very present, but that's something else. Next slide, please. And what happened is that a few days after this first meeting, the French government select only a few of us. This group, France COVID-19 Scientific Council, was set up on March 10 and confirmed by an emergency health law a few days later on March 23. It's a picture that was taken on March 12 during the first meeting of the Scientific Council at the Élysée Palace, also the last time we met physically because of the lockdown, and after that we were working, and we are still working all the time, but not meeting physically. So that's the only picture that exists of all of us as a group. Next slide, please. The COVID-19 Scientific Council is independent of government. In the service of openness and transparency, we chose to publish all our advices online, to make them public online, and so they are posted on the website of the Ministry of Health. Its members are a mix of medical and non-medical experts. So medical, we do have people in immunology, public health, virology, epidemiology, infectious disease modeling, intensive care, specialist GP, etc. But what is most specific is that we are also a few non-medical experts, including 2 social scientists, so myself as a social anthropologist, but I also have a colleague, which is a sociologist. We ask to have a digital technology specialist because of the use of digital technology in contact tracing those days, we all know. And we clearly requested after 2 weeks to be able to select and have with us a digital technology specialist. So that's very new, that's very specific to this pandemic. And we also have an NGO representative with us in that council. What is interesting is that half of us have expertise in French health system, while the other half offer expertise in epidemics and humanitarian crisis in the global south. 5 of us have expertise in both, which is my case, but also people in immunology and infectious disease. And this double expertise is very much being used today in the Scientific Council to fight the pandemic in our own country, which is France. I will tell you more about that. So that's just, I will go quickly, but it's like a picture of all us with Jean-François Desfrécy on the right, which is the president of the French Scientific Council, which is, for you Americans, more or less, not equivalent, but he's very close, his career is very close to the career of someone you might all know, which is Anthony Fauci. So Jean-François Desfrécy has had the same type of career as a very well-known scientist, specialist of epidemics, and very respected scientist in France. maybe the next slide. All right, so what we have, as I said, because trust is important, I mentioned it before, because transparency is important, especially if scientists are supposed to advise governments on how to respond to a pandemic, and especially as our advice are very much listened by the French government, which has put science at the heart of its response to the pandemic publicly, and so that's very specific to what's going on in my country in the response to COVID-19. Because of all that, this is a list of, in fact, all the advices and strategic papers that we did provide to the government and that we did put online. And in fact, what you can see is that, in bold are the ones that were the most important in a way. We're still working, but especially the first few policy papers or advices, I am not sure how to call it in English yet. It was about lockdown because we did advise the French government to implement a lockdown. And then we did also very much work on the progressive release of containment of lockdown with prerequisite and key measurements that will be needed to be put in place before ending lockdown. And very recently, the last one, June 2, is proposing 4 scenarios for the post-confinement, post-lockdown period, and in fact for the next few months until autumn, on how to anticipate to better protect. In fact, designing 4 scenarios so that we are in fact trying to design an operational plan for the French government that they will be able to use as tools depending on how the epidemiological situation will evolve. Maybe next slide. But as I said, what is very difficult is, and again, remember, I'm a member of that council. We're still working, so I'm not speaking about the past experience. I'm speaking about something that's going on right now for me, but also in my country. What is very difficult, as you might imagine, is the scientific uncertainties and expertise, how to combine both in support of decision-making during a global pandemic and an humanitarian crisis. It's a very difficult exercise. But with each in our respective roles, the Scientific Council providing independent advice and the French government making choices and deciding what is best for the nation, the modus operandi of the two have proved successful so far. On most issues, but not on all. For example, regarding school, we were very much against reopening school, made it public, government chose to reopen it. And a number of other issues also, there was a disconnection between our advice and the political measures that were taken, which is great. We do have 2 different roles. But on most issues, the strategy proposed by the Scientific Council has been adopted by the French government. With this operational arm, an interministerial team created especially for that, to fight COVID-19, actively putting the strategy in place. So I can't say more about it right now because, as I said, we're still working. There is a Lancet paper that has just been accepted that is trying to present the role of the Scientific Council and the strategy. So if some of you are interested, this publication should be available soon. Maybe next point, and I will finish with that. I wanted to share that with all of you today. I did with my team and a large number of French academic and institutions, but also international organizations such as the World Health Organization, but many others, recently created a new research institute, which is called COVID-19 Ad Memoriam Institute. The goal is to bring together multiple worlds, researchers, caring profession, artists, jurists, philosophers, victims associations, but also religious leaders, spiritual authorities, entrepreneurs, etc., to pull thinking about the pandemic. Because COVID-19 is a major anthropological disruption for our globalized planet. And since consequences will be numerous and long-lasting, the challenge is to take their measure and strengthen our capacity for foresight and collective resilience. So, it's very much supported by the World Health Organization. It's based at the University of Paris, and it's a consortium that brings together, as I mentioned, a very large number of institutions and personalities. There is 3 goals. If we can go to the next slide. The first is to research in order to understand. We are going to try to focus on understanding why COVID-19 was able to paralyze the world in only a few months, and the extent of the resulting psychological, social, and economic damage is only now gradually emerging, and we need to collectively understand what happened and what will happen in the next few months and years. Next slide, please. The second goal is really trying to understand in order to act better. As with major past conflicts or epidemics, COVID-19 is also imposing changes that are potentially beneficial to society also. And it's important that these too be examined, and that on that there is no shortage of topics. So to take up this challenge within the new paradigm of collective intelligence, the Institute does bring already together a full range of people, as I said, in order to try to not only understand but act collectively in the next few months and years. Maybe we can go to the next slide and I will end up that. And the last objective of the Institute is trying also to act in order to remember. It's also going to provide a space for preserving history and maintaining the memories of events, large and small, linked to the epidemic. It will try to preserve our memory of the acts of courage and dedication that helped to mitigate the effects of the pandemic and contribute to outlining sustainable solutions for the future. It will encourage both collective reflection and invention of new commemorative practices. Next slide, please. So you are welcome to join. There will be an American branch. We are already working on it. So whoever is interested is welcome to join. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Laetitia. That was awesome. In fact, thank you, Farana and Sam, for a great presentation. We've got lots of positive comments from our participants. Thank you to everyone who stayed on the line. 22 minutes past when we were supposed to end, but it was really an engaging conversation. So I wanted to thank everyone, not just the presenters, but all of you participants as well. There's been a lot of interest in the materials that you all used to create this presentation today. So we'll be following up there. We had some questions about what we've learned and how can we respond to COVID-19. And Laetitia, it looks like the Institute and the work that you've just been describing at the end is really going to be addressing that. So we don't have any others. I've been responding to some specific questions in the Q&A throughout the presentations. Most of them have been addressed, but a lot of them have been, thank you very much. This is really interesting. Great job. So I wanted to echo that to all of you as well. But I really just wanted to thank all the participants for staying on the line and seeing this through to the end. It was hopefully well worth your time. Does anybody have any final comments you'd like to make before we close today?